In the popular perception of the 18th century, there exists an unfortunate and a deeply negative stereotype of the women who followed the army. That they were scoundrels, thieves, that they were all drunken prostitutes who would prey on a licentious soldiery, spreading disease and sin as they went. It's all a part of that classic image of the scum of the earth army, a classic myth that would struggle to be further from the truth. Now, women did march with the army, that's true, but they weren't parasites. They were far from it. They were an integral part of military life, who were every inch a part of the regiment, along with their soldier husbands, and without whom the army would surely have suffered intensely along not only psychological grounds, but material ones as well. Yet still, these myths remain, reducing women who should be held in high esteem, I would argue, as a sort of veteran in their own right, into nothing but sexualized and sullied stereotypes. It's a shame, and in this video, I want to do my small part to help combat that myth. Because at the end of the day, I believe that our understanding of the past has an incredibly powerful ability to inform our perceptions of the present. Because history matters. And how incredibly convenient that this video is my contribution to a massive collaborative project which goes by just that name. I have teamed up with a whole slew of other history YouTube channels, big and small, covering all sorts of different and fascinating topics, all with the core aim of combating those common yet meaningful historical myths and misconceptions. Because all of us, whether we're talking about ancient Rome, the British Empire, or the Cold War, all of us firmly believe that history matters. And if you do too, then after of course watching this video, I can only encourage you in the strongest possible terms to visit the playlist linked down below, where you will find the rest of the videos in this eclectic little series of ours. I hope that you enjoy them. There are some real gems there, some channels that you may not be familiar with, and of course a lot of work has been put in by all of the participants, so go check it out. But otherwise, returning to our particular piece of meaningful history, let us begin by asking perhaps the biggest and most difficult question: why would these women follow, quote unquote, to get to that soon enough, why would they follow the army to start with? As we begin, I should note that this video is very much coming from the perspective of the British military, but most of the principles that I'm covering here are more or less broadly applicable to most European armies of this time period. Now, the 18th century was not, for the most part, a terribly accommodating time period for women. A woman who was without a husband faced a unique set of challenges, socially, economically, even in terms of physical safety. And when a man enlisted, he often did so, practically speaking, for life, with terms lasting up to 20 years plus. So in order to avoid becoming an abandoned woman, as they were sometimes called, women often had little choice but to follow their husbands into the service, especially if they had children who needed to be supported, and if they didn't have other individuals in their lives who could watch over them, like fathers, brothers, or other appropriate relations. Although this doesn't mean that all of these soldiers' wives were marching with the army on campaign. It was actually quite the contrary, but we'll see that in a future section. Following the army from garrison to garrison meant that not only could couples remain together, it meant that a man could more reliably support his family through his pay. Although there was an infrastructure in place for soldiers to send money to their families through the regiment, and it was the responsibility of his officers to make sure that those payments wound up in the right hands. But all the same, you can imagine how adding those levels of bureaucracy might get in the way of things, as opposed to just literally being there and being able to pass it off directly. And alongside the payment, of course, there are many other ways in which a man might be able to watch after his family by being physically present, which otherwise wouldn't be the case. Again, the 18th century, not exactly the best time to be anything other than a man. It also allowed a regimental wife a certain level of social security to be with the regiment, which she might otherwise be lacking if she were alone. For example, some basic forms of healthcare through the army, protections against poverty and food insecurity, even opportunities for employment, all while being surrounded by other individuals who are going to be in similar positions, as opposed to being, socially isolated as the aforementioned abandoned woman or any variants thereof. As the wives of the regiment were, in their own respect, representatives of that regiment, sort of a part of the regiment, it was often considered the duty of the officers to ensure that these women were well and cleanly clothed, that they were eating well, and that any children were dutifully even attending school if they were able to do so. Indeed, many of these regiments would establish regimental schools for the education not only of their NCOs to learn how to read and write, which was very important in the qualifications for example, a sergeant, but even, yes, for the regiment's children. And if a woman had kids, that was a fantastic way to secure them an education, even the beginnings of a trade, the trade being soldiering, which otherwise might be, prohibitively expensive for the child to achieve in civilian life. As published in the Standing Orders of the 2nd Battalion of the 56th Regiment in 1805, boys put on the strength of the regiment, which is to say, young recruits, go to school, of course. Soldiers, children of the regiment, though not on its strength, will receive their education gratis. The schoolmaster, while acting as such, shall be obeyed and take rank as a staff sergeant. And if a woman or her child became ill by chance, regiments would sometimes be able to provide for them out of a regimental charity fund, usually funded by the regimental officers. And incidentally, the tradition of these charity funds is ongoing in the British Army, and it represents one of the many strengths of the regimental system. Of course, even with all of these material advantages to accompanying the army, one cannot discount the emotional elements, which might prove just as, if not even more, powerful a cause. Like I said, this was a time of long service, where a man might be enlisted for 20+ years unless he happened to be wounded or otherwise discharged from service. And this was also a time when the systems for actually informing families of the fate of their loved ones, should they be taken prisoner, be wounded, even outright killed, while it would range from being intensely unreliable to outright non-existent. And for many, they would only discover that their loved ones had perished in some obscure battle on a far-off continent weeks or even months after the fact in a newspaper which listed the casualties, if they were able to find out at all. I don't think that I need to espouse on just how terrible that anxiety, that sense of waiting and being powerless can be, even for those in similar situations today, when obviously communications are so much improved. It's still difficult to be in that position. And even if we look to certain official documents, we'll see those emotional appeals bleeding through, such as in the Standing Orders and Regulations of the 85th Light Infantry, published 1813, where in the section that was detailing how it would be decided which women could accompany the regiment and which ones couldn't, it reads that, quote, "It is wished that every officer and soldier should consider his regiment in a great degree as his home, and that it may appear to be a sort of inhumanity to separate a soldier from his wife." Far from it being a matter of last resort, women were often desirous of joining their husbands, whether they were at garrison on home service or even abroad during wartime. So much so, in fact, that the Army even had to take steps to limit the number of women who were able to do so, as we'll soon enough see. Now, when asking a question like, why did women march with the Army, I think that the answers could be as broad and as varied as, why did the men enlist to begin with? There are going to be as many answers as there are examples, each with their own unique mixture of both practical and emotional considerations. Still, these basic ideas might at least give us a framework from which to consider the question. But what they don't do is tell us about the other side of things. Why was the Army so accommodating of all this, of families and such? Sure, officers might go on about the regiment being a great big family and all that, but during, peacetime on home service and such, that's all well and fine. But we know that these women would remain with the regiment even on deployment, even during wartime. How could something like that be justified? After all, military life, even if it is like a family, necessarily it has to be driven by practical military considerations. And at the end of the day, dead weight can be among any army's worst enemies. Well, before we come to all of that, I just want to take a quick moment to thank the people who helped to make this video possible, my financial supporters. Whether their support comes via Patreon, from the booking of cameos, from PayPal tips, from tipping on live streams, or of course purchasing merchandise. And hey, there's a new Etsy store, by the by, so go check it out if you haven't already. There's some great stuff there. It really is thanks to all of you, regardless of where that support comes, that I'm able to do what I do, that I'm able to make these videos. You know, individual sponsors, they come and go, and ultimately they don't care about the educational value of these videos. They don't care about why I make them to begin with. All they really want are the views. But it's all of you. It's all of the supporters on the ground that I can actually rely on to be there for the actual content. You care more for the quality, for the educational value, than just for the numbers alone. And so sincerely, thank you. Thank you all. And if you're not yet a supporter, but if you're enjoying this video, if you enjoy the other videos like it, if you enjoy the primary sources that I post on my website, if you enjoy the artwork that I can on rare occasions commission, and if you think that what I am doing has value, well, then I would ask you to just check out some of the links in the description, or to visit my website, nativeoak.org, and see some of the ways, some of the many, many different ways in which you can help out with that mission. And of course, not all of those methods of support even cost money. For example, you can watch these videos on Recast. That is a greater help than you could possibly know. All right, anyways, that is enough of my shameless plugging. Let's get back to the content. The life of a woman in the army was anything but idle. They weren't just trailing after the army, eating its food and slowing them down. They were actually a part of its infrastructure. They were expected to earn their bread, pay their own way. And this was generally by taking on jobs within the army. And no, those jobs did not include prostitution. In fact, in pretty much every regulation and account that discusses women in the camps, you'll see pretty much the same sentiment echoed. That the women must be industrious and they must be moral, that any behavior to the contrary would see them immediately drummed out of camp. No woman of bad character, read a prostitute or other such underground worker, is to be ever admitted into a barrack room, one regulation would state plainly, while another that their regiment shall be a home of comfort to those who are entitled to feel its benefits, but shall not be a source, as is too often the case, of multiplying misery and prostitution among those who should be under every good soldier's peculiar care and protection, and that all women of immoral or drunken characters, or who refuse to work for the men, are warned that they will not be permitted to remain, although also that they will not be turned adrift on the world, for such an act is never to disgrace the corps, but their friends shall be written to, or means shall be taken to have them received in some poorhouse, or situation where they can earn their bread. So basically, no ill will, but we can't have you here. It's just not working out. Instead, women would take on a variety of different roles of varying importance. In some situations, those would be some of the more stereotypically feminine jobs, keeping barracks clean and cooking when on garrison. But for the most part, those sorts of duties, especially cooking, it wasn't something that the women would be doing except for themselves. And especially on campaign, it would fall to the men to prepare their own rations because the women also had much more important things to be doing. So this idea that, the women in the camp are doing all the cooking, for the most part, that's really not the case. If you want a great example of historical misconceptions impacting the modern world, there's a great example right there. Whenever you go into a reenactment and we see all the soldiers just hanging around, palling around under a massive marquee tent, which they shouldn't even have to begin with, and then all their wives and girlfriends are doing all the cooking and all the housework, at least in the majority of situations, that's going to be very, very inaccurate. And I'd argue that, again, at least in many instances, it probably rests more on modern-day sexism than it does on any actual documentation. A much more historically appropriate thing for the women to be doing, and probably the single largest job that they would have typically had historically, would actually be the laundry. Now, okay, admittedly, maybe that doesn't sound too serious at first, given the earlier ranting about sexism and whatnot. But seriously, doing the Army's laundry was a massive undertaking of incredible importance. This was a day and age, of course, before laundry machines, and doing the wash, it was a time-consuming, a physically very demanding task that always needed to be done. I mean, think of the way that these soldiers were living, marching and drilling for days on end in the heat, especially in the North American heat, firing muskets with that acrid, horrible black powder smoke just blowing all around them and seeping into every nook and cranny on the cloth and such. Sitting around the campfires, performing day-to-day physical labors of fetching wood and water and all the rest. This is tough stuff. And most soldiers would only have, 2 or 3 linen shirts to swap between under their uniforms. We aren't just talking about a slightly uncomfortable smell coming from them. We are talking about the actual physical condition of the men and their uniforms, especially in a day and age when humoral theory basically connected bad smells with bad health. This was a lot of clothing that needed to be washed on a regular basis. The number of shirts and necessaries which are to be washed for each soldier is 2 of each, and at least 2 false frills, per week. 1 of each to be delivered to the soldier by the washerwoman every Wednesday and Saturday afternoon. On the delivery of these on Wednesday afternoon, the shirt, false frill, and socks to be washed are then to be returned to the washerwoman, and on Saturday evenings after inspection, she is to receive the others. She will, on that evening, receive from the pay sergeant of the company 4d for the week's washing, or 2d for each of the 2 periods. There were a lot of regulations around the Army's laundry and the women that did it, and it was important that they be kept, because oftentimes the women would use the money given to them for their services to purchase the necessary supplies to keep doing so, like their soap, for example. It's all a part of the so-called interior economy of the regiment. As it often happens that the women who wash for the soldiers are not punctually paid, by which means they are unable to provide that quantity of soap the linen must require and thereby sooner rub out, the pay sergeant should be directed to stop the washing from those who are so idle to neglect a punctual payment, and every week clear off the women who by this method can have no excuse for not doing justice to the linen. These military jobs also often followed a similar hierarchical structure to the Army itself, with the wives of sergeants, for example, being the ones to divide officers' clothing between them, working alongside the others on the lower ranks' clothing with any time they have left over. But laundry wasn't all. While it may not have been quite so omnipresent a role, perhaps an even more important job, especially during times of stress for the Army, was that of nursing. In one of his many amazing articles on this topic, which of course I'll be linking in the description down below, alongside plenty of other resources, Don Hagest writes that nurses were a, quote, integral part of the Army medical system. Although this wasn't a specifically trained position in the modern sense of the word nurse, these women working alongside the regimental surgeon performed a wide variety of different tasks based on what needed to be done and presumably the individual ability of the woman as well. Everything from what we today associate with orderlies up to, again, proper nursing jobs. Everything from keeping the wards clean and distributing food, to helping make sure that the soldiers were taking their medicine, monitoring them and their injuries, helping to, move them, really anything that you can imagine, any sort of task that the surgeon and the other officers may require, anything that needed to be done, they were there to assist the regimental surgeon. In particular, before or immediately after a major engagement, different regiments would often be obliged to send certain numbers of their women into the Army's general field hospitals, and if the situation was really bad, nearly all of the women might be turned out to help facilitate all of the different wounded. And in which case, these tasks weren't so much an occupation which the women would take on to support themselves, so much as they were pressing jobs for which their labor was conscripted. They didn't always have a choice to go into the hospitals any more than a soldier would have to go on picket duty, although they would generally still be paid for this work the same as any other occupation. It's just that they would be liable to such work if the good of the service demanded it. Another possible, although perhaps less exciting, source of industry for the regimental wives came in the form of seamstressing, the making and altering of clothing alongside the regimental tailor. This might come in the form of continual streams of button replacements and patch installations. It might be the repairing of linen shirts and other clothing that's being just, constantly worn down by continual use. It might be the sizing of new clothing for fresh recruits. And on those occasions where the army was in need of very large quantities of clothing to be done up in very short periods of time, again, for example, like if you're bringing in a whole bunch of new recruits, well then, much like the hospitals, the army might press women into service with the regimental tailor. Alongside the slew of military occupations and many others besides, it was also common for women to take up temporary local employment when they were on garrison duty, much like the men would, as a way to supplement their income. Typically, the army was fine with such arrangements, so long as they didn't interfere with the person's ability to perform their official duties, although in the case of the women, there were a set series of occupations which they were forbidden from entering into, such as firefighting. So to put it simply, the women of the regiment weren't just army wives dutifully following their husbands. They were a significant and a reliable force of, I guess you could say, like quasi-civilian labor for the army to pull from. They took care of countless vital tasks which the army needed to survive, but which they couldn't effectively deploy their own soldiers to engage in without detracting from their needs to drill, do sentry duty, engage in, other forms of labor, fetching wood and whatnot, all sorts of different things. They couldn't exactly have all their soldiers also acting as nurses in the hospital, after the battle when they're the ones who need to be taken care of, And because of all this, I think it's really important that we make a distinction, that the wives of the regiment weren't just following the army, they were a part of the army, and an important one at that. And as with any other element of regimental life, the presence of these soldiers' wives was a matter of strict regulation, with rosters being made to track them, officers to watch over them, and obligations to be met. The presence of women and children in a military environment, as with any non-combatants, was often a delicate one. Just as these individuals could bring great benefits to the force, they could also prove a severe detriment to it. They could slow the army down. They could provide more mouths to feed than they were really worth in terms of the labor they would produce. And as such, a variety of regulations regarding soldiers' families were in place at both the regimental and the army level. The marriage of soldiers, being a matter of benefit to a regiment, of comfort to themselves, or of misery to both, exactly in proportion as it is under good or bad regulations, has been much considered. Much as it is wished to contribute to the happiness of every individual in the regiment, it is necessary that regulations should be made and enforced upon the subject of matrimony upon the principle that it is better that a few individuals should enjoy the real benefits of any institution than that by a number aiming at it, the general good effect should be lost to the whole. A large portion of these regulations were aimed at the number of women who would actually be able to march with the regiment, both at home and abroad. And this was also a source of much consternation, with those few permitted slots for regimental wives being quite coveted. For the 85th Regiment, for example, the number was limited to 6 women for every 100 men, and that's including the NCO's wives. The number, it may sound very small, but the regiment was keen to point out that it was ultimately in everyone's best interest to keep it kind of low. This number is ample and indeed more than sufficient for a light corps, as every officer and soldier who has ever seen service must admit. It shall never be exceeded on any pretext whatsoever, because the doing so is humanity of the falsest kind. Women who have more than 2 children can also never be in the number to embark, except in extraordinary cases, because that is a still greater act of inhumanity. The Light Corps in particular often had a good need to keep these numbers light, given how comparatively rapidly they could be sent out to deployment, and when some of the regiment's women were inevitably sent home, they did what they could to make that process as equitable as possible. The women and children who are then to be sent home are to be chosen by lot, if of equally good characters, sergeants' wives excepted, and will receive such benefit as the private regimental charity fund can afford, in addition to the bounty, which has been lately granted by government. Again, looking to the amazing work of Don Hagest, he's provided a chart made up from returns across many different regiments in the New York area between 1779 and 1780, where he shows just how many women and children were reported alongside the total troop counts. And according to his findings, there was a general range between 1 to 10 and 1 to 6 women to men, with around 1 to 8 being typical, and the figures for children being generally around the same. So that gives you an idea of what sort of ratios we're looking at here. And that same ratio aligns more or less pretty well with some later regulations. For example, the General Orders, which came from Horse Guards to Wellington's army in December of 1811, which actually kind of forced the issue by controlling the amount of rations which the army would receive for the women. So it would be in proportion. To being enough for 6 women and their children for every troop or company when they were in the field, and to 12 women and their children when they're in garrison, with some exceptions being made to things like the veterans battalions, and as well to the widows and orphans of the army. They wouldn't be counted in those ratios. They're going to be fully victualled until they could be sent home. On the other side of things, to accommodate for the many women who were hoping to join the regiment, some regiments would create rosters of all the men's wives. Then, whenever a spot opened up, the first name on the roster would be sent for to join the regiment, and all the other names might move up the list. But not just anyone could get onto that roster. No, for a soldier couldn't just go off and marry whomever he wished. First of all, he had to apply to his captain for permission to wed, who in turn would bring the matter before his commanding officer, but only after, quote, having fully informed himself of the character of the woman, whether she has friends who will receive her in the case of necessity, upon the regimental regulations about the soldiers' wives being made known to them, and whether she is willing and capable of benefiting the corps as a washerwoman or seamstress. Otherwise, of course, permission would be denied. Indeed, for any discerning colonel, the moral character of a woman who sought to enter his regiment would be just as important as that of any of his soldiers. It was of such importance that Cuthbertson, praise be unto him, in his Interior Economy, dedicated an entire chapter to the marriage of NCOs and soldiers and the methods for preventing improper ones as much as possible, where he talks about all sorts of different ways that the officers might, quote, make inquiries into the woman's morality and ability to work, and the need for officers to basically inform the local ministers and other religious leaders to not marry any of their soldiers except without the officers' express permission. It's basically a guide on how the officers can get involved in their soldiers' romantic lives. Should a man ever deign, indeed, to marry without due permission from his superiors, he might expect a court-martial in his future, resulting in demotion and even confinement, while his ill-gotten wife would likely not be permitted to join the regiment. And for those women who did receive permission to join the regiment, they were expected to follow certain elements of military discipline as well. For example, they were made to attend divine service every week, as their husbands were also required, either at a nearby church, should the commanding officer secure them a spot for such, or on parade with the regiment, with a specific spot in that hollow square being left vacant for them, so that they can make sure to receive the proper word and all that. Other lower-level regulations might include a prohibition on smoking in sleeping quarters, certain elements of military decorum, for example, and should a woman be found lacking in any of those smaller scale regulations that are being decided on a regiment-to-regiment basis, well, then it was even possible for her to become a defendant in a court-martial. Although, granted, a woman being punished by a court-martial, it's not going to be anywhere near as bad as a man potentially being punished by a court-martial. Though on the other end of things, good behavior was not without its benefits, sometimes coming in the form of additional freedoms for both the woman and her husband. Cuthbertson writes on the subject with his own recommendations, such as that men who are married to sober, industrious women ought to be allowed to lodge with them, so long as those lodgings aren't too far away from the rest of the company, and that the NCOs always know where to find those men. Additionally, so long as they can be dependent on for eating well, a man might be excused from the regular mess, of which the women would not take part, and he might dine with his wife instead. Although, of course, such benefits also required the increased attentions from officers in order to prevent their abuse. Officers should frequently inquire into the married soldier's manner of living, that they may be enabled to prevent in time any ill consequences which may arise from the indulgence of permitting them to be with their wives. And all of this, of course, being the case when on garrison duty. You can imagine how being in a hostile country would change things. So, on the whole, you might say that it was a bit of a mixed bag. Specific regulations and qualifications, they're going to vary from regiment to regiment, year to year, even the abilities of individual officers to actually enforce those regulations. But one thing is always going to be certain across the board, that regardless of what extra amenities or even laxed discipline might be offered to those sober and industrious women for good behavior and the like, regardless of the benefits, the lives of the regimental women often mirrored those of the soldiers, of their husbands. And in garrison, that meant a secure life, to be sure, but a one full of hard work. It could hardly be described as wealthy or easygoing. And when they were on campaign, those lives had the potential to be ones of most terrible privation and even of danger. And so we come to the inevitable and most unfortunate section of our video, and also, I believe, the most important one. The section which cements the high esteem in which I hold the regimental wives, and my belief that they do not receive anywhere near sufficient credit or due honors for their services. Now, on the whole, very little is known about the material condition of these women, especially when they were on campaign, as while they are near universally referenced in military sources, we don't always get a lot of detail regarding the practical considerations of their lives. What we do have typically points, I suppose we could say, to about what you would expect. That these women were not rich, that they didn't live a life of feminine luxury. They lived lives of hardship. They lived lives of privation, often the same as any soldier would. One such insight into their lives comes in the form of a rare property inventory of a certain Mrs. McQueen, which was made after her death while she was in North America in 1780 with the Army. It's a simple list consisting of 2 blankets, 4 petticoats, just spelled differently, 4 shifts, 3 short gowns, 1 pair stockings, 1 pair shoes, 1 apron, 1 coat, 1 waistcoat, and 2 shirts. It's possible that those shoes are actually going to be men's shoes, as they were sometimes issued to the women and were often handed down to them as new pairs were given to the soldiers. And indeed, in period artwork, women would often appear, in this environment of course, they would often appear wearing men's footwear. The coat and waistcoat as well are likely going to be regimental clothing that's handed down as they inevitably became overworn and replaced for the soldiers themselves. And there's even a distinction here, you may have caught it, between the shirts and the shifts, which might again imply that the shirts were initially menswear, soldiers' shirts that were given over. It's a small image into the appearance and the physical condition of these women. It's a very small lens, but it portrays a very distinctive image, I think, one of really of downtroddenness and rugged practicality. Now, something that I do have a lot more information to share with you about would be the emotional condition of these women and the extraordinary things that they suffered as a natural consequence of their military service. If you are familiar with any of my much older work, then you may remember a video of mine titled Widows in the Army, The Tragic Tale of Mrs. Calkin, where I read and remarked upon a particularly emotional account from The Recollections of Rifleman Harris, a memoir of a rifleman during the Napoleonic Wars. Though despite the fear of repeating myself for at least a few of you, I'd like to begin with a briefer summary of this account. It was just after a large battle, when the rifles were standing in formation to be inspected by their officers, when the wives of the regiment came out to them. Moving between the ranks, they met with their husbands. One may imagine exchanging loving embraces and doting after lighter wounds and such. Some women, however, were unable to find their partners in the usual spaces, and one woman in particular had been calling out in desperation for her husband, Mr. Joseph Cocken, to which she had received no answer. Harris would remark, "The name struck me, and I observed the poor woman who had called it as she stood sobbing before us and apparently afraid to make further inquiries about her husband." The name struck Harris because he had seen Cocken fall in the battle as a musket ball pierced his skull, and so after a moment he eventually worked up the will to step forward and inform an officer that he knew where the man had fallen, and so in pity for the widow, he was instructed to lead her to the body. She now soon discovered all her hopes were in vain. She embraced a stiffened corpse, and after rising and contemplating his disfigured face for some minutes, with hands clasped and tears streaming down her cheeks, she took a prayer book from her pocket, and kneeling down, repeated the service for the dead over the body. Afterwards, Harris was able to find one of the Army's pioneers and beckoned him over to assist in burying the body amidst the field of dead and dying before he and Mrs. Cocken would return to camp. He would then describe her condition later that night. She lay among some other females who were in the same distressing circumstances with herself, with a sky for her canopy and a turf for her pillow, for we had no tents with us. Poor woman! I pitied her much, but there was no remedy. Such visions of horror and sorrow were hardly unique, nor were they always so clean, however. Cocken had received a small ball to the head, and he died rather quickly, but not all men had such luck, and nor were their wives able to locate and identify their bodies so easily for that bit of closure it might offer. During an assault in the siege of Ciudad Rodrigo, which I'm probably mispronouncing, as British forces were closing through a gap in the city's great big walls, the French set off a large explosion underneath them. And the terrible, terrible results of that were recorded after the fact by Rifleman Edward Costello. I now proceeded to the right breach, which had been carried by the 3rd Division where the mine had been sprung. The sight exhibited was heartrending in the extreme. The dead lay in heaps, numbers of them stripped and displaying the most ghastly wounds. Here and there, half buried under the blackened fragments of the wall or reeking on the surface of the ruin, lay those who had been blown up in the explosion, their remains dreadfully mangled and discolored and strewed amongst dissevered arms and legs. The 88th, or Connaught Rangers, had suffered most severely at this spot, and I observed a number of poor Irish women hopelessly endeavoring to distinguish the burnt features of their husbands, navigating fields of rubble and severed limbs, attempting to make out the charred remains of their loved ones. That was the fate of many of the regiment's women. When a woman's husband was killed, the Army would, to the best of their ability, arrange passage for them back home, as well as providing them sufficient money to make the rest of their journey. For example, in 1775, regimental returns show that 54 women and children from various regiments were sent home, primarily coming from those bodies of troops which had suffered the most heavily at the Battle of Bunker Hill. The precise levels of aid which these women would receive would also vary, depending on a variety of circumstances. In some cases, it wasn't even possible for them to be sent home, but they would forge on with the army, listless, until either they remarried another soldier, which was actually quite common, and were thus permitted to remain with their regiment, or until some transport or other sort of refugee cartel was able to be arranged. But we'll come to some examples of such painful lingering momentarily. For their part, many individual officers, even outside of the official structures, would do what they could to alleviate the suffering of the regiment's widows and orphans, When the British Army occupied Philadelphia during the American War, some officers opened up a playhouse where they put on performances for their benefit, while another officer would write a book, which he published for the benefit of the children and widows of the valiant soldiers inhumanly and wantonly butchered by the rebels. Of course, not every story would end in tragedy, and repeatedly, the wives and other women of the regiment would prove to be just as capable of hardy resistance, of making sacrifices, and even taking risks for their comrades as their husbands were. For example, in the account of the Baroness Friederike Charlotte Riedzel, the wife of a German general, and she accompanied him during the Saratoga campaign, she wrote of an instance during battle where she and a group of wives were assisting some of the wounded men in a basement, away technically from enemy fire, but still very much in danger. Because we were badly in need of water, we finally found the wife of one of the soldiers who was brave enough to go to the river to fetch some. This was a thing nobody wanted to risk doing, because the enemy shot every man in the head who went near the river. However, they did not hurt the woman out of respect for her sex, as they told us themselves afterwards. So in this one instance, the woman's sex was enough to save her life, presumably, at least supposedly, according to what the soldiers said after the fact. But on the whole, they hardly had an easier time of things resulting from that characteristic alone. On the contrary, in fact, womanhood carried with it a wholly distinct form of potential suffering and privation which might need to be overcome. And these challenges and the abilities of certain women to overcome them became shockingly apparent to Rifleman Harris during the Army's disastrous and desperate retreat during the Corunna campaign. I remember, among other matters, that we were joined, if I may term it, by a young recruit when such an addition was anything but wished for during the disasters of the hour. One of the men's wives, who was struggling forward in the ranks with us, presenting a ghastly picture of illness, misery, and fatigue, being very large in the family way, towards evening stepped from amongst the crowd and lay herself down amidst the snow a little out of the main road. Her husband remained with her, and I heard one or two hasty observations amongst our men that they had taken possession of their last resting place. To my surprise, however, I, some little time afterwards, being myself then in the rear of our party, again saw the woman. She was hurrying with her husband after us, and in her arms she carried the babe which she had just given birth to. Her husband and herself between them managed to carry that infant to the end of the retreat, where we embarked. That child would actually survive the campaign, and Harris would see him a few years later, describing him as a strong and healthy lad. Ultimately, however, not all of these stories had such happy endings, or even held in them such a tragic poetry as all the examples I've listed thus far might be considered to hold. It is an unfortunate state, I think, that whenever the difficulties that these women faced are discussed, whether it's by historians today or even contemporaries of the times, that it's often through the lens of their male counterparts. It's the image of the grieving widow. It's the Mrs. Calkins of the world. It's the women picking through the remains after the siege trying to find their husbands. It's the image of someone who is impacted by military action, but still in some ethereal, some feminine way, remaining distinctive from that impact. As if these women were alongside the army, yet not fully a part of it, as if they were not risking their lives as the soldiers did. But of course, that wasn't the case. Military service, marching through hostile country, and even the nature of living on campaign itself, all of which could be a deadly business. Because perhaps the worst enemies of all, of sickness, of fatigue, of the elements, did not discriminate on the basis of sex. The enemy, I should think, were at this time frequently close upon our trail, and I thought at times I heard the trumpets come down the wind as we marched. Towards the dusk of the evening of this day, I remember passing a man and woman, lying clasped in each other's arms and dying in the snow. I knew them both, but it was impossible to help them. They belonged to the Rifles and were man and wife. The last we ever saw of them was on that night, lying, perishing in each other's arms in the snow. And while we might sing the praises of the so-called gentlemanly warfare, speaking of certain honor-bound codes of conduct, ultimately the path of an enemy shot sent astray may prove just as unreliable as the individual who pulled the trigger. We had not proceeded far towards the main road along a pathway partially protected by a hedge from the enemy's fire when one of my companions heard the cries of a child on the other side. On looking over, he espied a fine boy, about 2 or 3 years of age, by the side of its dead mother, who was still bleeding copiously from a wound in the head, occasioned most likely by a random shot from the enemy. We carried the motherless and perhaps orphan child by turns to Regimental, where we found a number of women of our division, one of whom recognized the little fellow, I think she said, as belonging to a soldier of the First Royals. The presence as well of children in these horrific environments was a terrible and natural consequence of allowing women to accompany the army. Really, it's a subject I think that warrants a video all on its own, but I feel like this example perfectly encapsulates not only the inherent danger of military service, but also a particular set of horrors which, unlike most in military history, feels much more grounded in the female experience, more so than in the male. It was, after all, the mother's duty in this environment to tend for her children, to protect them. But sometimes, heart-rending though it may be, that simply wasn't possible. And it might lead to some of the greatest sacrifices of all, just as intense as any of those that may be found on a field of battle. About this period, I remember another sight which I shall not to my dying day forget, and it causes me a sore heart even now as I remember it. Soon after our halt beside the turnip field, the screams of a child near me caught my ear and drew my attention to one of our women who was endeavoring to drag along a little boy of about 7 or 8 years of age. The poor child was apparently completely exhausted, his legs failing under him. The mother had occasionally up to this time been assisted by some of the men, taking it in turn to help the little fellow on, but now all further appeal was in vain. No man had more strength than was necessary for the support of his own carcass, and the mother could no longer raise the child in her arms, as her reeling pace too plainly showed. It was a pitiable sight, and wonderful to behold the efforts the poor woman made to keep the boy amongst us. At last the little fellow had not even the strength to cry, but with mouth wide open stumbled onwards until both sank down to rise no more. The poor woman herself had for some time looked a moving corpse, and when the shades of evening came down, they were far behind among the dead or dying in the road. There exists a trope of the foul-mouthed, drunken, gambling prostitute following after licentious armies of scoundrels. That the so-called camp followers were often little more than leeches, and not the medical sort, preying on the armies and proving a great headache to those military leaders of more sober conduct who just wished to conduct more meaningful business of warfare. And unfortunately, in my experience, these ideas can even be particularly prominent in certain reenactment and other historical circles where sexist jokes and off-color remarks can be more the norm than just the occasional lewd exception. These ideas aren't just factually incorrect, they're offensive. And I don't just mean that they're offensive because they're rude or because you have to treat the ladies nice. I mean because they're insulting to a class of individuals who, for one reason or another, served their country. Individuals who underwent extraordinary hardship and loss, suffering alongside the soldiers while engaging in vital business which helped to maintain the health and condition of the army. Without them, the soldiers would never have been able to do what they did. To mock and deride, to look down on their role is almost like mocking the role of factory workers in one of the world wars, or members of logistical corps and such. Sure, they're not out there shooting the guns, but without them the guns wouldn't be able to fire. The women of the regiment's talents and value wasn't derived from their sex, but in their extraordinary character, in their resilience and strength, the same as with any good soldier. These were traits that transcended being a man or a woman. Were there, prostitutes with these forces? Were there women, even regimental wives of ill repute and sin, who meet those negative stereotypes? Absolutely. Those who would bring drink into camps, flout regulations, prove a dead weight to the army. Of course there were. Just as every basic policy and rule and fact that I put forward in this video, it's all going to have its exceptions. And just as there were men in these armies, indeed in every army, including today, who were drunkards and thieves and wife beaters and rapists and murderers. But for both sexes, these were the minority, and we do not condemn the entire class because of these certain exceptions. We do not cease from wearing our poppies because some soldiers are scumbags, because the majority of them are not. The same exact thing with the women. For the most part, I believe that the women of the regiment, the soldiers' wives, deserve more credit. I believe they deserve more attention and more respect than they often receive. They were a vital and constant presence in military life during the long 18th century, and we would do well to remember that, particularly when we're seeking to portray this time period in our media and at historically themed events like reenactments and such. Because understanding the past, truly understanding it, is vital to the manner in which we conceive of our modern-day world. And if we cannot respect the veterans of history, how are we supposed to respect the sacrifices made by veterans today? Because history matters. Now, thank you all so very much for watching. And remember, everyone, that this video is only one part in a massive collaboration where a whole bunch of your favorite or soon-to-be favorite channels have tackled popular historical misconceptions and myths. If you'd like to see any of the other videos in this playlist, I'll have it linked in the description down below, as well as in a pinned comment. I apologize that my contribution to it was a little late, but I hope it was enjoyed all the same, and thank you very, very much to all the other channels who have participated. I hope that you enjoyed the experience and found it beneficial for your channels as well. Thank you very much. And of course, special thanks are always owed to my generous patrons over on patreon.com, without whose financial support I would absolutely not be able to make long-winded videos like this one. So if you've enjoyed this video, you have all those fine individuals to thank just as much as you do myself. And of course, until the next time, my dear viewer, I am and I shall remain your most humble and obedient of servants.